2,000 years ago, the Chinese Emperor Shennong was burning the clippings of a bush to boil a pot of water for drinking. The fire had dried the plant's leaves, and it had caused them to rise on the heat and land in the pot of water, which infused the water before Shennong drank it. Shennong found that after this, the water could cure many poisons, could vitalise the soul, and tasted great as well. The news spread quickly, and Shennong taught his people not only agriculture and the domestication of wild animals, but how to cultivate and brew the tea plant. In the veiled dawn of prehistory, the tree originated in the tropical jungles and hills of modern southwestern China, Burma, Laos, Vietnam, and Thailand. From first travelling there, humans will have chewed the leaves and gained its invigorating effect, caffeine. As humans mastered agriculture, it was taken from the jungles and hills to be planted alongside crops in the plains. The plant was definitely in wide use by 141 BC, when tea was included in an emperor's grave. Specifically, only the tea bud was included, which is the most valuable and flavour-filled part of the plant. This shows us that tea was in wider use, because including lower quality leaves was unsuited for the emperor. That was what the peasants drank. By the 3rd century, tea was consumed in Tibet. It was brewed alongside other unidentified plants, probably similar to a modern Tibetan butter tea. Tea plants cannot grow in the high altitudes of Tibet, meaning that the tea must have been traded from a place where it could grow. This gives us evidence of the tea horse road between Tibet and China. Tibet wanted tea, and China wanted sturdy military horses. Tea could not only demonstrate wealth, it could also create it. Tea probably spread to eastern China sooner than it did to Tibet, and followed the path of Buddhism. Several prestigious Buddhist schools were established throughout China, which had attracted East Asia's best and brightest. Tea was used in these establishments to remove the monks from the stresses and details of everyday life, and so monks came from all over the Buddhist world to study in China, and they took back their knowledge and experiences of the tea plant. In Korea, it became associated with passage into the afterlife, and perhaps as early as the 7th century, kings in Korea offered it to their ancestors, but certainly by the 10th century, Korean monks offered it to their deceased fellows. In Japan, a monk named Eisai is credited with bringing back the tea seeds, planting them and growing them on the southern island, Kyushu. From there, they were taken and planted outside Kyoto, where the emperor could consume it. It quickly spread to the laity, and the rest of society began to drink it too. Chinese, Korean, Japanese and Tibetan cultures developed whole ceremonies around tea, together creating truly intimidating lists of tools, processes, accoutrements and constructing whole buildings purely for drinking tea. The enjoyment of tea became integral in every culture that it touched. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to bring tea back to Europe, but they did so in small quantities as a novelty for sailors and royalty. It was the Dutch who were the first to bring back commercial quantities of tea in the 17th century. This tea began its life in the Fujian province, where it grew, was picked and then dried. It was carted to the ports at Xiamen and Quanzhou, where the Dutch took it around India and then Africa and up to Europe. This long journey made it prohibitively expensive. At the point of purchase, it was 6 to 10 times more expensive than coffee. In September 1658, England's first commercial cup of tea was sold, where it was described as the China drink, named Tay or tea. It took England by storm, and in less than a year, tea, alongside chocolate and coffee, was sold in almost every street in London. For over a century, all of the tea in Britain and in her other possessions was sold to suppliers by the monopoly of the East India Company, making supply of tea flanked on two sides by monopoly. There was also the round trip from England to China and back, which took a third of a year. For the longest time, tea was about demonstrating wealth and experience of exotic culture, arguably more than it was about enjoyment. In Britain's colonies, tea was one of the only forms of taxation that the British government could levy. Though even these taxes were cut, the core issue was ideological, the lack of representation that the colonists had in the English Parliament. Those pesky colonists boarded merchant ships and threw the tea overboard, an event that became known as the Boston Tea Party. No taxation without representation became a central aspect of the American Revolution and eventually of American identity. Of course, the colonists went on to give representation to all strata of their population, but the British had a bigger problem than just unruly colonies. Their demand for tea was huge, but it was all dependent on China's supply, and China would only trade tea for silver, which, due to the Chinese tax system, effectively lowered taxes for everyone in China. This was draining British coffers. Anna Russell, the Duchess of Bedford, found herself getting hungry at an inconvenient time. Her lunch was served at noon, and her evening meal was served fashionably late, leaving her hungry in the afternoon. So she began to have tea, sandwiches and cakes. She invited friends, and the fashion quickly spread among the nobility and the emergent middle class. Dainty pots contained brewing tea, milk, sugar, and platters containing sandwiches and cakes were consumed over idle chit-chat. This was the birth of a ceremony known as afternoon tea. Britain could not only get tea easily from China, but it also began to grow and cultivate its own plant in India, which increased supply and allowed prices to drop. The Suez Canal had cut the circumnavigation of Africa out of shipping routes, and this shortcut was free for British ships. The advent of steamships made this journey even faster, reduced the risk, and consequently reduced the price. All of this added together to mean that in Britain, unlike anywhere else in the Western world, in the palaces of Queen Victoria and in the slums of Manchester alike, everyone could drink tea, and it cemented into the national identity. Nothing screams British like an East Asian plant brewed in hot water, maybe with a little bit of sugarcane grown in the subtropics.